We now return to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Opportunity Project, the radio show discussing honest truth about Illinois policy and politics. Here's AM 560's Dan Proft.
Welcome to another edition of Illinois Rising. Dan Proft here. I'm the co-host of AM 560 Chicago's Morning Answer with Amy Jacobson, weekdays 5 to 9 a.m. And with me is Pat Hughes, the co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project. Also, and most importantly, for the purposes of our discussion, the president of the Liberty Justice Center. Liberty Justice Center, one of the representatives of Mark Janus, the plaintiff in a seminal case that was argued before the Supreme Court this past week, Janus v. AFSCME, that seeks to effectively eliminate fair share for public sector workers who are members of a public sector union and who don't want to be. This case, again, oral arguments this past week. You'll have a Supreme Court decision rendered before the end of June. And it was a combination of Pat and Liberty Justice Center senior attorney Jacob Huebert, along with National Right to Work, that argued the case before the High Court, Pat. Quite a moment, potentially. It
was quite a moment, Dan. Our client, Mark Janus, is a public sector employee who's not a union member, but he's still forced to pay dues to support the union activities. He doesn't want to do it.
Again, here in Illinois.
In Illinois. He doesn't want to do it, and everything a public sector union does, Dan, as you know, including collective bargaining, is political in nature. They're lobbying for tax dollars, and as a consequence of that, it's a violation of his First Amendment rights of free speech and free association to be forced to pay those dues. We made that argument to the Supreme Court, and now, like you said, we're waiting the ruling. But it was quite a day.
Let's bring in your colleague, Jacob Huebert, to add some weight to this conversation. Jacob, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Sure, happy to be here.
So, as a lawyer, Jacob, as you know, a barrister such as yourself, you need to be able to make the argument for both sides to appreciate the arguments that are going to be advanced on both sides. So, distill the argument that AFSCME is making from the public sector union's perspective as to why fair share should continue to be enforced.
Well, one of the main things they argue is that, the government here, it's not really acting as the government when it's making people pay these fees. It's not like when the government regulates an ordinary citizen's conduct. It's just acting like an employer here, and making people pay these fees to a union. It's just like a manager managing a workplace, and it can decide for itself as an employer how it wants to deal with its employees. So the First Amendment either shouldn't come into this at all, or it shouldn't provide too much protection for employees.
And why is that a specious argument?
Well, it's specious because we're not talking about an internal workplace matter. We're talking about making people give money to a third party that's a private organization that is going to use that to advocate for public policies on a wide range of issues, not just limited to workplace matters. We know from our experience of watching what they do. Of course, it doesn't really make sense that an employer would want to funnel money to its adversary in bargaining. Normally, if you're trying to beat somebody in bargaining, you don't want them to be stronger by making everybody give them money. That just doesn't make any sense. And of course, we know the real reason for this is because the people who run the state in Illinois and these unions, they're not on opposite teams, they're on the same team, and they're just trying to funnel workers' money and taxpayers' money to this organization that supports the politicians who run this state.
And Dan, a good way to look at this, and Mark Janus, I did a bunch of media with him over this last week, as did Jacob, and what he says is, look at it in the state of Illinois. So AFSCME has asked for a $3 billion raise. That's his union, a $3 billion raise in collective bargaining. And obviously we have $100 billion in plus debt, and the state's in a financial shambles. And Mark Janus's position is we shouldn't be asking for that money. And on top of that, AFSCME is going out and advocating for a tax increase to pay their benefits. Mark Janus is opposed to that. He's opposed to the idea that they would ask for that they'd collectively bargain for that they'd ask for tax dollars to be spent in that way. And yet his money is subsidizing that very activity, and he's opposed to it. And nobody in our country should be forced to speak in a manner that they're by the government that they don't want to speak in, or associate with people if the government forces them to, that they don't want to associate with, and that's what he's being forced to do in this context.
Jacob, let me ask you a question. How did the justices take it when Pat Hughes got up there and said, "You're out of order.
You lie.
The whole damn system is out of order"? Did that perk up Ruth Bader Ginsburg when he did his Al Pacino impersonation?
I'm not sure anything would perk up Ruth Bader Ginsburg, to be honest with you.
Well, now speaking of the justices, notably Neil Gorsuch, the most recent addition to the court, who has taken the spot once held by Antonin Scalia, it was the one justice who asked no questions. What did either one of you interpret from that?
I don't think you can interpret anything from that. You know, even when they ask questions, it's hard to know what they're really thinking based on that. So I certainly can't take anything from what a justice doesn't say, a justice's decision to keep quiet.
Yeah, what I would interpret from it, Dan, is that Neil Gorsuch didn't want to become the story. And anything that he said on either side would be nitpicked. It's all anyone would talk about.
Because he's perceived as the tie-breaking vote.
And if you looked at the oral arguments, Jacob, I think you'll agree with this, not just because of how they ruled in Friedrichs, but based on the questioning. It was clear to me that it's 4-4 and we're waiting for Gorsuch. And he didn't want his telegraph or have his thing become the story, is my guess.
That makes sense to me.
Jacob, what are the implications in Illinois if the high court rules in favor of Janus? What are the policy implications, landscape implications here?
Well, the first thing is, of course, every government worker at every level will be able to choose whether to give their money to a union. And that means that the unions in this state, the government unions, won't have this unfair advantage that they've had for decades, where they get to fund their advocacy with money from people who don't want to support it. And so that'll create a fairer political playing field where it isn't so tilted toward the unions and the political establishment that they support.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think that the impact of this, and Dan, just, obviously it's going to have a major impact in Illinois because of the nature of public sector unions and how they're involved in our politics, but it's going to have an impact nationwide because there's 5 million people and about $600 million a year in fair share dues that are being paid. And so it'll have an impact, and I think that's why the unions are fighting it so vociferously, not just in the court, but in the court of public opinion. You read articles this week, there's a lot of, this is going to kill unions. It's not going to kill unions. If people want to be part of a union, they can still be part of a union.
Speaking of the court of public opinion, Governor Rauner went to D.C. to hear the oral arguments as well. You guys were there, and there's been a bit of a back and forth, or maybe just no forth, between you and Governor Rauner about his role in this case and some of the pronouncements that he's made on the case. You sent him a letter slapping his hands a bit.
Yeah, so he initiated the case in 2015, which he deserves credit for, but he was summarily removed from it because he didn't have standing to pursue it. Since that time, he's had absolutely no role in the case. He didn't even file an amicus brief, which several executive and politicians across the state, office holders across the country did. And he's taking credit where he shouldn't be taking credit, but more importantly, Dan, he's making wild predictions about success publicly. We have a 90% chance of winning, he says, and things of that nature. And I just asked the governor to stop taking credit for work he's not part of and to stop making predictions. It's bad form and it's bad for the case. And the other thing about the governor is he's perceived as a union basher, and Mark Janus isn't. And I don't want Mark Janus and our case to be tied to Bruce Rauner's politics. It's not good for the case. It's not good for the message moving forward.
It seems to me that he's so desperate for something that resembles a victory that he's kind of latching on wherever he perceives one may be available.
There's no question that I perceive that as well. And frankly, I'm not concerned with whether or not he gets a victory or not. What I'm concerned about, and I know Jacob's concerned about, is our client's rights, the status of this case, what happens in this case, if we're successful, how the case is implemented, how we persuade people to pay attention to what their rights are going forward, and everything the governor has done publicly and politically cuts against that.
What was Mark Janus? So what was the final straw for Mark Janus? Because as you mentioned, he has been an employee at the Department of Human Services for some time. And so why did he decide to pursue this case at this time? Was it the impasse in the collective bargaining between the governor and AFSCME, or was it something else?
the way he tells the story that, it's always bothered him. He's been doing this for 11 years. But yeah, it became the impasse. It became this enormous spend that they wanted to do. And finally, he was like, look, I'm fed up with this. I've been paying this a long time. It's bothered me. But now I see the implications of it. And we were very fortunate to find Mark Janus. He's a wonderful person. He's a wonderful plaintiff. He's not political in any way. He's just principled. And he feels very strongly about his First Amendment rights and how these are being violated. It takes a courageous act to walk up those steps of the Supreme Court, Dan, with all the union people out there, all the protesters, all the press. And frankly, he was remarkable.
And it's the courageous who will be remembered. And the Janus AFSCME case could be a case that is remembered for a long time in the annals of Supreme Court jurisprudence. LJC, Liberty Justice Center Senior Attorney Jacob Huebert, thank you for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Sure.